The hum of the city below my apartment never seemed so loud as it did that morning, rattling against the glass of my living room window. I smoothed my silk blouse over my chest, the soft ivory fabric brushing against my skin, and glanced at the sleek, modern clock on the wall. 8:07 a.m. My phone buzzed on the marble counter, a sharp vibration that made my heart skip. I hesitated before picking it up, knowing exactly who it was. It was a text from my sister, the kind that felt innocent but carried a weight I wasn't ready to bear. "Dad wants to see you tonight for Christmas dinner. He said he has something important to tell you." My chest tightened. Christmas had never been easy. I remembered last year, how his words cut deeper than the cold winter wind. "You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." 40 strangers had been staring at me when he said it, their forks frozen midair, and I'd walked out without a single word. Now, years later, I had a life they didn't know existed. The apartment I called home, the company I'd built from nothing, the late-night calls to clients I couldn't afford to lose, they all mattered more than their approval. Yet, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even old hurt, made me wonder why he had sent that message. I took a deep breath, letting the hum of the city fill the silence between the memories and the present. Some invitations weren't just about dinner. They were about ghosts you thought you'd buried. I was 19, fresh out of college, and still figuring out how to breathe in a world that never seemed to let me. That Christmas, the house smelled of pine and roasted turkey, a scent I should have loved. Instead, it was the backdrop to humiliation. I had stayed home that year, hoping to be part of the family I thought I belonged to. "Enough, Emma," my father had barked, his eyes narrowing like daggers. "You've done nothing but take from us. You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." The words landed on me like ice water, shocking my entire body. My hands trembled. My fingers dug into the edge of the chair to stop them from shaking. A lump lodged itself in my throat, making it impossible to speak. 40 faces turned toward me, some shocked, some smug. I had never felt smaller, more exposed. My mother looked away, her lips pressed tight, and for the first time I realized that even blood wasn't always on your side. In that moment, I clutched the small pendant my grandmother had given me weeks before, a tiny silver key, worn at the edges, dangling from a thin chain. "This," she had said softly, "is a reminder that doors open for those who create their own way. Never let anyone lock you in." I left that night with nothing but a small bag, my grandmother's words echoing in my head. I didn't have a plan, but I had resolve. Each step down the snow-dusted sidewalk felt like shedding a weight I didn't realize I had carried. Fear, doubt, the desperate need for their approval. The city lights blurred in the tears I refused to shed. I felt small, yes, but also fiercely alive. That night, I promised myself that I would never allow anyone's judgment to define my worth again. I would survive. I would rise. And one day, I would return. Not as the girl they had scorned, but as someone they couldn't ignore. The first weeks after leaving home were a blur of cold nights, cheap apartments, and the gnawing uncertainty that I had traded one prison for another. I had no steady income, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and yet, in that chaos, I discovered something I hadn't known I possessed: resilience. I found a small job at a boutique marketing firm downtown. The office was cramped, the air stale, and the coffee barely drinkable, but it was mine to conquer. My mentor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire, took one look at my anxious demeanor and saw potential. "Stop apologizing for taking up space," she told me on my first day, her words cutting through my self-doubt. "You're here to build something. Do it like you mean it." Every evening after work, I'd sit at my tiny kitchen table, the silver key pendant glinting under the dim lamp, sketching ideas for freelance clients I could reach online. The first contract was modest, barely enough to cover my phone bill, but it was mine. The first profitable sale came 2 months later, and I felt an unfamiliar thrill, a sense of control, of agency. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was shaping a future. Learning was brutal. I spent hours teaching myself design software, marketing strategies, and finance spreadsheets. There were nights I cried quietly into my pillows, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of knowledge I had to acquire. I questioned my abilities constantly. Yet, for every doubt, there was a small victory: a client who praised my work, a project that came in under budget, a mentor's nod of approval. Slowly, the fragments of my hidden life took shape. I rented a loft downtown, sparse but filled with light, where canvases of my own design adorned the walls. I opened a business account under my own name, and for the first time, the numbers in my bank statement reflected something I could be proud of. I started posting small, innocuous updates on social media, coffee mugs, skyline photos, but nothing about the growing empire I was quietly building. And yet, every success was a secret, a quiet rebellion against the family that had cast me aside. I imagined their faces if they knew. I imagined Christmas dinners that no longer held power over
me.
I was becoming someone they couldn't dismiss, someone who would eventually rewrite the narrative that had defined me for so long. In those months of struggle and triumph, the silver key around my neck became more than a charm. It was a talisman of independence. Every time I touched it, I remembered my grandmother's words: "Doors open for those who create their own way." And I had just begun unlocking them. The knock on my office door startled me more than I expected. It was mid-afternoon, the golden light spilling across my minimalist loft-turned office, highlighting the canvases of abstract designs I'd painted myself. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. And there they were, my parents and sister, dressed for what looked like a casual visit, but carrying the same air of expectation I remembered from every Christmas dinner I had endured. They froze when they stepped inside, their eyes scanning the space. My loft was modern, elegant, and unapologetically mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Shelves were lined with books on entrepreneurship, art, and self-growth. A sleek oak desk sat at the center, adorned with a laptop, a leather-bound planner, and a small stack of contracts, proof of the empire I had quietly built. My father's jaw tightened, the words he had spat years ago still visible in the lines of his face. My mother's eyes widened, a mix of confusion and shame. My sister, always so quick with judgment, looked almost frightened. I let the silence stretch, watching their reactions with the calm patience of someone who knew the power of timing. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady, warm, and just sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You all probably expected to see a struggling girl, someone still dependent on your approval," I began, touching the silver key around my neck for a brief, grounding moment. "But that girl doesn't exist anymore." I walked them through the story they had never known: the company I had founded, the clients I had acquired, the revenue streams that allowed me to live independently and luxuriously. I showed them a few contracts, carefully curated but impossible to deny. My net worth, my ownership stake in the business, and the life I had built, all of it was real, and all of it was mine. Their reactions were instantaneous and varied. My father's eyes went wide, guilt and disbelief warring on his face. My mother's lips quivered as she realized the magnitude of her own neglect. My sister's fingers twisted nervously in her lap, a faint flush creeping over her cheeks. None of them could speak. They were staring, taking in the full weight of my transformation. I let them breathe it in for a moment longer before continuing. I walked away because I had to survive. I thrived because I had to believe in myself when no one else would. And now I'm standing here, not for your validation, but because I finally can. The room felt heavy, with unsaid words. I could see the shame settling over my father, the slow recognition that the girl he had tried to dismiss had become untouchable. Not untouchable in arrogance, but untouchable in resilience, in self-respect, in the quiet power that comes from building your own life from scratch. And then, as if the air itself had shifted, I felt it, the sweet, almost surreal satisfaction of a secret long held finally revealed. They weren't just seeing me, they were seeing the woman I had fought to become, the one they had underestimated for far too long. I paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling the subtle tremor of authority in the room. The roles had reversed, and for the first time in my life, I held the upper hand, not with anger, but with clarity. I could choose whether to embrace them or to walk away entirely. And I chose the former on my terms. "Here's the thing," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I am willing to let you back into my life, but only if things change. Not for me, but for yourselves. For the family you've been avoiding while expecting me to remain trapped under your judgment." My father swallowed, his pride warring with the recognition in his eyes. I continued, laying out the conditions one by one. "You will acknowledge responsibility for the hurt you caused. No excuses, no shifting blame." I met his gaze evenly. "You will pursue your own dreams instead of clinging to old expectations that suffocate those around you. My success cannot exist in the shadow of denial and resentment." Turning to my mother, I softened slightly. "You must stop protecting family pride at the cost of honesty. It's never too late to learn to support rather than smother. And yes, that includes admitting when you're wrong." My sister shifted uncomfortably. I offered her a small, steadying smile. "You've always been quick to judge, but now is your chance to become someone who lifts instead of tears down. Start by recognizing the strength in others, even if it's me." They hung on my words, a mixture of guilt, shame, and tentative hope written across their faces. I could see the internal battle, the fight between old habits and the possibility of change. I didn't rush them. Power without patience is wasted. I added one final condition, holding up the silver key I always wore. "This," I said, "is a reminder that doors open for those willing to work for them. If you want a place in my life, you must prove that you can create your own doors. You must respect my boundaries and the independence I fought for. Anything less isn't acceptable." The weight of my demands hung in the air, but I could see it, the flicker of understanding. They weren't just hearing my rules. They were feeling them, realizing that the woman before them wasn't the same girl they had tried to control or dismiss. I ended the conversation not with a threat, but with clarity. "I care about you, but I will never compromise my life to meet the expectations of the past. I will guide, but I will not carry. And if you're ready to step into your own power, then there's a way forward. If not," my voice softened, but my resolve remained steel, "then you'll learn to live without me, as I once had to learn without you." For the first time, the room held no tension of shame or fear, only potential. The tables had turned, not in vengeance, but in self-respect, in the kind of power that comes from surviving, thriving, and refusing to let old patterns dictate your worth. Weeks passed, and the changes began quietly. My father started volunteering at a community center, something he had always dismissed as not serious work. My mother enrolled in a creative writing course she'd shelved years ago, finally chasing the passions she had abandoned. My sister, once critical and dismissive, began mentoring young interns at her office, learning to lift others instead of tearing them down. I watched them grow from a distance at first, careful not to overstep, letting them discover their own power as I had. Each small step they took was a reminder of why I had demanded boundaries, why independence had been my only path to survival. And yet, despite the lingering shadows of the past, I could see moments of genuine connection, laughter that wasn't forced, and glances filled with respect rather than judgment. One evening, I sat in my loft, the city lights shimmering below, holding the silver key in my hand. It had been years since my grandmother gave it to me, and yet its weight felt as real as ever. It wasn't just a charm, it was a symbol of resilience, of doors unlocked through courage, patience, and self-belief. I smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for the journey. Every setback, every sleepless night, every sting of rejection had led me here. I realized then that the story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, growth, and the quiet power of standing firm in your worth. I had built a life where I could choose my relationships, where love and respect were earned, not demanded. The woman who had walked out of that Christmas dinner all those years ago had returned as someone unshakable, whole, and unapologetically alive. And as I placed the key back around my neck, I whispered to myself, almost as if passing it forward to the woman I had become. I will never let anyone define my value, but I will always remember the doors I've unlocked and the strength it took to open them. For the first time in years, I felt a profound peace. I was no longer the girl cast aside at the dinner table. I was Emma, the woman who left, who thrived, who returned not for validation, but for truth, strength, and grace.